There was no company that had anything close to solving for this specific problem, and keeping my composure, setting up these trap questions, getting into more of a systematized approach to this, that's what ultimately set me up for success.
Having a system in place allows you to stop worrying so much about creating custom negotiation terms on a deal by deal basis.
Whatever you're going to do when it comes to sales, when it comes to business and all these different things, this is a normal thing, and it's only as awkward as you make it.
And just like saying that, I don't have to discount a single cent, and I get like 3-year contracts left and right. All right.
Back at it.
We're back. This time I'm opening it up here. So today we're going to talk about how not to be a slimy salesperson. Yeah. This is something that I think everybody encounters, and I think something that everybody is thinking about before they join. And coincidentally, we just recorded another podcast where we talked about, just like how there is this stigma of being slimy, of being pushy. It definitely still happens in tech sales. And I think there's a couple of different things or like steps that you can take to actively counteract them. So I kind of have a laundry list here. Before I jump into that, do you have anything you want to?
No, I think this is a very real one for anyone on the outside looking in at sales. This could be, maybe it's your first job, but also, I'm a former engineer for 3 years and really hesitated on switching into sales because I saw many of these things. I was like, I'm not that person, but at the same time, I was hyper competitive, hyper driven. And if there's any regret I have in my career, which is not many at this point, it's just waiting so long. Yeah. So again, I'm not here to blindly wave a wand and say sales is for everyone, but I imagine if people clicked on this, they've been looking at sales. So like we have lived both sides of this. Both of us have had distinct careers and lives and athletic careers before this. So yeah, I think it's going to be really valuable.
Yeah, I think this is good. And I think this is a good one too, because we have pretty different selling styles, I think.
Yeah.
Like you're very direct and you own that. Like I couldn't be that direct. I sell more on like empathy and like vibes. And so that's another thing that we're going to talk about. It's just like how like there is no right strategy or style or way to do this, right? Like it's not like, and this is the big problem. I mean, if you have been following this podcast for a while, we have probably shit on LinkedIn influencers a little bit too much.
Yeah.
But that's why we don't like that, essence of content on LinkedIn and like, scripts, templates, all those different things. Like we're not against it. There's definitely value there. But it just kind of goes toward like, you just have to find, what you're confident with. Anyway, yeah. Jumping into the first one already, I'm going to go through the topics that we're going to cover here, and I'll just jump into the first one. So the first one is confidence. Just find the strategy, sales style that's most natural to you. Asking non-cringy discovery questions. Yeah. Not asking the terrible questions of like waving the magic wand and all that shit. Trap questions, like getting answers to your questions without directly, actually asking them. This is something that I do a lot. And providing value, probably the most vague thing that you ever hear in tech sales. Yeah. Having a system in place for pricing negotiation, something that helped me immensely, I think, in maintaining my ACV, feeling confident. I mean, all of these are kind of intertwined, more or less, but a super, super key one there. And not being desperate or chasing prospects. Like there's a lot of things outside of your control. So focus on what you can control and then go from there.
Yeah.
But to sort of go back to the beginning, maybe let's start with confidence. I'll throw it over to you.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think this was a big one because I doubted myself. I wanted to be like the anti-sales guy. There was a period of my career where my first, 2-ish years, I did really, really well, like 200+%, and then kind of cooled off that end of second, beginning of third year. And it's really because I was trying to get like too fancy, trying to kind of like outsmart my prospects. And what I would say is like, sure, we'll break this down in a lot more detail of how you don't have to be this slimy, aggressive, salesy, stereotype. But at the same time, when it comes to confidence, like if you're going to be a salesperson, be a salesperson. And I definitely don't want to blow this wide open and talk about like dating and all of these different things. But I really think as a simple analogy for anyone on the outside looking in, it's like if you're going to ask someone you're interested in out on a date, you better do it confidently. It's like, this is a thing that happens. Salespeople have been around for a very long time and they're not going away anytime soon in any industry. And don't get me wrong, there are absolute sleazeballs, people that are selling things to people that they don't need, pushing them for no reason, all of that. But the flip side is like, we're going to talk about concepts like provide value. And that's another one on the other end of the spectrum that gets overused, because what happens is you'll give too much value. You'll say, oh, what else can I do for you? Can I get you this? What does your team need? Like anything else, and there is a line on the other side. So I think this more, at least from my perspective, having been that engineer that sat on the fence for 3+ years of doing sales, That's the biggest thing I would say. You're not going to have this figured out day one. You're not going to be the world's best salesperson by just faking being confident. However, the worst thing you can do if you're going into sales in a position like mine where you're unsure, you might be leaving a different career. If you go half and half, if you go 1 foot in, 1 foot out, not only are you going to do a disservice to yourself, but your prospects are going to pick up on that. You're not going to have the body language to control a conversation. And again, control is a word that could be misused, but just like this, like I'm owning this point, I'm very succinct, I'm very confident in what I'm talking about, and I'm sure we'll continue to break it down, but that's the major thing I want to express to that person that's on the fence is like, salespeople exist. If you're going to do sales, be very good at it. There are general principles that will help you get there as you craft your own style. But the worst thing you can do is be 1 foot in, 1 foot out. The worst thing you can do is try to overcompensate and not be a salesperson because you'll lose deals. Your prospect too is going to be like 10 times worse. Like had you asked an uncomfortable question in certain situations, we kind of rip the Band-Aid and we can move on, right? And I don't want to get too meta, but the flip side is again, like if you're unconfident, if you're too afraid to push, if you're too afraid to qualify them out and say, hey, actually you're probably not a serious buyer, like those are the things that I just are huge mistakes for people that were in my situation like 5-6 years ago. So I'll pause there. But.
Yeah. No, I think we just recorded another pod which was about frame, like very like ties in heavily into this too. I don't think that you can have frame without fully being confident in what you're doing, right? Because if you're, I mean, to your point, like if you're going out there, you're looking for inspiration, you're taking something from here, taking something from there. Like we talk about this all the time, but like you're gonna end up with this like weird style that isn't yours, that's like 5 other people's, and you're trying to like mix it in a mold that you definitely can do that though. Like I'm not saying, I think that's actually the way to go about it, but I think you have to adjust it. You have to like, you know, change it to match like how you sell, right? Like lean into your strengths instead of trying to be somebody that you're not. Mm-hmm. Like if you are, like to your point, like if you are the type of person that's comfortable with having those conversations, like address it head on. Like I would say that's the best way to go about it. I think your selling style, extremely powerful. Like I couldn't do it. But I think, yeah, like if that's how if that's how you're comfortable, for instance, like you wouldn't try to sell how I tried to sell, right? With like empathy, because that's just not like, I mean, you are still empathetic, but you're a lot more direct than I am. Yeah. And so I think it's just about like leaning into your strengths, right? Don't try to be something that you're not. Like instead of trying to, you know, emulate every single little thing that like is making this person successful, that person successful, X, Y, Z, try to think about like there's so much advice out there. Try to think more through the lens of like, can I find somebody who sells in a similar way as I do? That's probably the person who you want to like start following, who you want to start like copying and emulating. Yeah. And I think that's why people appreciate like our styles, because we're so like on each side of the spectrum. Yeah. But yeah, I think like you're not going to have frame, you're not going to have confidence if you don't lean into something where you feel like, hey, I feel natural in this. Yeah. Right. Like if you're trying to like be pushy or like not pushy, but be direct when you're not a direct person at all. Mm-hmm. I think there's something like there's still personal development, all this stuff. I'm not going to get too zen here. But anyhow, I was
just going to add, I mean, and I think this translates to other assets or aspects of life. Like, you know, I mentioned obviously like a dating example, that's a common one, but even for people watching this, like this is not an inherently like comfortable thing just because we're in sales. There's other risks of us making content, you know, at least on the outside looking in, you know, maybe you say one thing wrong and your company gets upset. Obviously we know like there's judgment coming from peers, that's just a part of doing this. But at the same time, the worst thing I could do is try and make content that pleases the algorithm. Or, you know, like for instance, one of the things I didn't like about all the sales advice when we started making content was there were these videos that are like 5 things you need to know if you're breaking into sales, and nobody likes that, you know. There was like a phase in time of that where that was, you know, common, but there was more depth that was needed. So anyway, I just want to bring this home in like different mediums and make people understand like whatever you're going to do when it comes to sales, when it comes to business and all these different things, like this is a normal thing and it's only as awkward as you make it. Like because of the fact that we are comfortable here talking, we're even more believable. Like you listening to this, you seeing other pieces of our content, and we're never doing the fancy animations saying like, you know, 7 things to change your sales world. Anyway, I'll cut myself off. I don't want to get too deep down that rabbit hole.
That's great. No. It kind of segues into the next one anyway. So it's like asking non-cringy discovery questions. You know, I think that's something that, and again, like it's all about execution too. So like you can take I've actually seen execution of, believe it or not, the magic wand question be okay in some cases. Okay, I'm not going to say good, great, or anything near that. I'm going to say okay. Like I've seen people that are very, very good at sales pull that off. I would never use it myself. But point being is like, you know, like how you execute, how you say things, how you carry yourself throughout a sales cycle is really going to dictate like, you know, how that question or whatever that you say is going to be perceived.
Yeah.
But I'll throw it over to you. I'm sure that you've had some cringy moments.
Well, I think, yeah, and what I would say too is, you know, obviously if you're watching this, we are focused on tech sales. Like if you're new to the channel here, we are genuinely, or generally speaking, focused on tech sales. This also changes at different levels of selling as well, because I think when you're in SMB and kind of mid-market corporate space, you have, generally speaking, shorter timelines, smaller deal sizes, and companies are trying to move faster. So there's one element of just the overall cringy questions like the wave the magic wand, etc. But I also think at a more nuanced level, especially even if you're SMB or mid-market and you're in a longer deal cycle, you meet this company, they're interested, and you know if they buy, they're going to talk, $500,000 to $1 million purchase. Like that's not going to happen in 2 months. So I also think there's like a very much a timing element of this. And also I've seen, for instance, in some of the enterprise deal that I ran, we brought in a very technical resource, one of our founders, they're going super deep. And I watched as, this was when I was ramping, I was shadowing a call at my last job. And the founder, CTO going super deep, the audience is just loving it, they're eating it up. We're not talking about a single thing sales-wise, business-wise. Again, this is something that's gonna take 9 months to even evaluate. We had already established the timeline on a previous call, but in the middle of this, the sales rep, like again, the CTO is bonding with their SVP of infrastructure, super deep in the call, and out of nowhere, the SVP says something that's kind of like a cue for the salesperson. He's like, hey, I just want to pause there and just understand, like, do you have broader metrics that measure the success of that stat? And it was just like, we're sitting there and like the founder and CTO is just like, you have got to be kidding me that you're interrupting, right? And there's converse examples of this where maybe you are too deep technically, but I think hopefully that provides some context as opposed to what we think are generally cringy questions. There's also a timing component of this that it's like, again, going back to our first point, there's a time and a place to be a salesperson, and you have to be willing to ask some of those questions about timeline, is this budgeted, who's gonna buy, all of these different things. But if you don't have a system, which I know we'll talk about, if you don't do these things kind of in order, you don't even put any thought into how you're structuring conversations, that's where you're really gonna come across as a slimy salesperson, because it's like, okay, like we were having a genuine conversation, now they need to check their box, and I'm a part of something that I didn't sign up for as a prospect, so.
Yeah, and you kind of just like end up being in this bucket of like all the other salespeople.
Yeah.
So now the only thing that you're being evaluated on is like the efficiency of your tool.
Yeah.
Where you had otherwise a unique opportunity to stand out and really give them a unique opportunity. So I think that's what we're striving not to do. I think like a good acid test of this is like, just ask yourself, like, how would you feel if somebody like asked you what you're about to ask them, or if you like listen to a gong call, right? Like think about the next time that you go into like a store and you're shopping for something, like how would you feel if somebody asked you that question?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, dude, if somebody, like I've never had somebody ask me like,
have you ever bought a $3,000 jacket before? Like,
Yeah. Or like, dude, if somebody asked me like if you could wave a magic wand, you would have like like, oh my God, I don't even know what I would do. I think I would just start laughing. And like, I have no like I never want to show disrespect to any salespeople. Like I respect the hustle across all industries and verticals, but I think that's a really good way to just like check yourself. If you feel like, hey, like why am I losing out on my deals a lot? Like throughout this stage, like what questions are you asking? Like literally, like have somebody like have your girlfriend, your partner, your wife, your husband, like have them ask you that question. I know this seems like such a dumb exercise, but actually like having somebody ask you the question is going to make you realize whether or not it's absolutely ridiculous or not. Yeah. So I think that's just a good little acid test, but
100%.
I think also like this ties heavily into the next one, which is like asking trap questions. So this is something that I did a lot. Yep. So I am not like a full-on direct seller. Like I'm direct when I need to be. I absolutely don't shy away from like the tough things. Like I don't want to get into a position where we're at the finish line, we don't have anything uncovered, like now we got to tackle 4 things. Like absolutely not. But I think that there's like for my personal selling style, like there's a way for me to uncover these specific things. So an example I always come back to is, for instance, like, whenever you're getting on a call with somebody, instead of asking like right off the bat, like who else are you talking to? It's like I'll just ask like in a very friendly tone, like, hey, how's it going? Do some small talk, like show that I've done some research on them, like saw you were out of XYZ, how you liking it over there, blah blah blah, right? Yep. And then from there, like I'll just ask like, how'd you find out about us? Like what do you know about Vanta? I want to make sure I can tailor this to you, and that, you know, this is your time, so I want to make it useful. And if they tell me, for instance, that like I just did a Google search, I know exactly what pops up in a Google search. So I know exactly who I'm competitive against, or that I have a high likelihood of who I'm competitive against.
Yeah.
And there's a very real chance that like they're going to elaborate on that too. They're probably going to go into like, yeah, we've had some conversations with this, and I might even ask something like, have you had any other conversations? Are you familiar with like compliance automation platforms? Just want to make sure I'm not like repeating anything that you might have already seen before. So like there are softer ways to ask these questions, and that's a timing thing too, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're at the beginning of the call and this is important for you and your sales cycle, then you probably don't want to come out of the gate asking a direct question like that. But if you're further down the road in that first discovery call, I think it's okay to ask like, who is you talking to?
Yeah.
Right? So it's all timing, it's all sales cycles, it's all depending on verticals, segments, XYZ. But I spoke a lot. I'm gonna throw it over to you.
No, I think I've got a really good example at my current company, but I'll probably have to be vague on that one. I think back to a very specific example. One of the biggest deals I closed early on in my career, we were in a very tight timeline, and it was very clear that we were being evaluated against two major players that came up commonly. And I had a candid conversation with the CTO and was just like, hey, we've got about 8 weeks to do this if we're going to do anything. It was a very critical situation. We were coming up on Black Friday. They had all this stuff, right? And same exact thing. It's like when I found out that they were looking at Amazon and also another provider called Rackspace, I didn't go immediately into defending it. I was like, okay, cool. I'm curious, like, from your vantage point, when you're looking at all of these, like, what are the most important things? I already know how we differentiate based on the 10 questions I've already asked. And then we keep going further and further, and I'm just queuing up point after point to really try and win at least this stage of the deal, which in this specific situation was hyper competitive, very short timeline. The winner is going to be the one that is most convincing to start a trial with. Because at that point, whoever would get the trial first was only if that did not work would they then look at the others. And so I knew right out of the gate, we had one of their biggest issues was scaling and the database crashing, AKA their website goes down, and they're an e-commerce company. Their whole business is down. And so, sparing the details, pull me out if I get too deep. It's like, again, there were opportunities to try and differentiate, but asking these trap questions, because I also knew everything about my industry, which comes with time, you don't get it like that. But to the earlier points we mentioned, sure, I was confident. I let them talk. I was like, yeah, sounds like a valid point about our competitors, all these different things. Like, oh, by the way, how are you guys supporting this database? And we had distinct advantages on the support side. And I'm just digging deeper and deeper. I'm very confident. I'm not worried that they're bringing up competitors. I'm just objective, just trying to know so I can better help them. And then, by the time that, it was time for me to give a quick pitch and set up a potential trial, it was like a no-brainer because I really stacked the deck in my favor and went deep enough on that discovery because, sure, confident, like that's one thing. But also I knew my industry incredibly well. And I knew that everything that they brought to the table, it would be one thing if we were closer in terms of which features applied to the most value, but like this one was a no-brainer. There was no company that had anything close to solving for this specific problem. And I knew that, and keeping my composure, setting up these trap questions, getting into more of a systematized approach to this, that's what ultimately set me up for, success there. So
yeah, I think the product knowledge and the market knowledge is something that comes over time. Like obviously, like if you're just ramping into a role, it's going to be a little bit tough. But yeah, like, getting to a point where you can have those conversations where you understand like if X then Y, right? Like another example, not to stay on this for too long, but like even for us, like we usually validate their tech stack. And so I know like if they are using a specific cloud provider, like Azure is a great example. I typically know that, okay, Azure's really expensive. It's a lot more expensive than AWS and GCP. So if they can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars as a smaller to medium-sized company, they can probably spend like $15,000, $20,000 on Vanta as well. That doesn't mean necessarily that they're gonna spend that amount of money on you, but you're kind of like using these proxies in your favor because prospects lie. Like that's just the case. They don't necessarily lie because they want to. They lie because they're uncomfortable as well going through this entire process. And so it's your job as a salesperson to listen to like, what are you being told? Like throughout your hundreds of other deals, what has this meant for you historically? And how can you now take this and you got to like think outside the box, right? Like I'm sure that you did that too. Like they probably told you a bunch of shit that wasn't true. And you got to like think around like, okay, like, based on this, based on that. So anyway, I think that's solid. I think also like moving into providing value. Obviously like there's ways to do this. There's ways to overdo it. You have some really good examples on this. So I'll let you explain a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is a dicey one, right? Because provide value. It's like if you ever hear that from like a manager or something, it's funny how your brain like shuts off. You're like, of course. But yeah, I think on the flip side, it's like picking your spots again of knowing when to do this. And again, like for instance, you're going to come across as a slimy salesperson, and going back to the topic of this entire conversation, like if you just hear provide value and you're willing at the drop of a hat to tell your prospect anything and everything, that's where you often get lost. And there's a middle ground here. Going back to that example I mentioned recently of talking to that CTO, we were competitive. Even if they asked me like, hey, we're looking at Amazon and we're looking at Rackspace. So can you tell me the differences? Like that didn't happen in that specific scenario, but I've been on calls like that where I'm like, hey, more than happy to, but quite frankly, I don't have enough context to really tell you the differences here. And so those are things that one are establishing yourself as a very solid salesperson, assuming you can actually provide that value. And then two, I'm queuing it up to give them the most comprehensive response in the shortest amount of time if they're willing to kind of like follow my sales process and sales leads. So there's many different things I could talk to, and certainly, maybe outside the scope of this conversation, this is very specific to tech sales, but I know like one of the things that, at least on the outside looking in, you kind of glamorize being the salesperson who's super confident, who goes and closes everything. When you get up to mid-market, when you get up to enterprise and you're managing customers and trying to upsell them in following years, it becomes a completely different game where, providing value sometimes is giving them the space to have the recording off and vent about the ways that your product has failed them immensely. Having very difficult conversations and being willing to have that and foster that and appreciate that, because if they're not happy now, it's better to hear it now than to just cross your fingers, not want to hear about it or deal with it, and hope that a year from now it's not so bad that they churn, right? And so there's many things I could apply. If you want to tap into those, feel free, but I'll pause.
Yeah. No, I think the whole essence of this started with like being a consultative seller and all these different things, and I think a lot of it stemmed from selling software that was overly complex that the average salesperson could not understand. And so, yeah, that was just like their way of saying, have some product knowledge. Yeah. But I've also seen this probably get overutilized to where like you'll see the Gong like talk track and it's literally like a person talking for 85% of the time. Yeah. And it's like, yeah, I mean, you might feel like you're being super helpful because you're giving them all of this knowledge, but there's a good chance they can't even like sit there and comprehend what you're talking to them about or what you're saying. Yeah. The problem is like almost like the curse of knowledge in a way when you've been in the industry for so long where you now know so much about the market, about the product, that you think automatically that others should be at the same level as you. You got to remember that a lot of these people are coming in, from the very, like they've probably done a couple of Google searches. Mm-hmm. And so it's your job. It's not your job to educate them on every single little thing, right? Because I mean, what you want to do is like figure out like what the heck are you even optimizing for? Right. And there's also something as like being overly, like providing too much value in a way. Because if you're telling them like every single little thing about the market, the industry, I mean, you've kind of like given your entire pitch before you've even like gotten there. Yeah. And now they can just go off and go with the cheaper provider because of all the context, because of all the value, blah, 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 blah. I've seen that happen many, many times before where it's like, yeah, so like, obviously we're more expensive, but this is what a lot of people do. And honestly, like people will go into like a trial with us and, because you can get compliant so quickly with Vanta, some people do it for like 4 or 5 days and then they just leave. We don't want that to happen. What do you think happens? Of course that happens. Yeah. And then they're like, hey, sorry, we're not interested. You look at their progress inside the platform, it's like 93%. Yeah. So I'm just saying like, it's a fine balance. Yeah. I think that like, you don't necessarily need to like, rock their world upside down. You just need to like it's okay to stop them and say, hey, like actually, I'd beg to differ based on XYZ. Yeah. Right. Yeah. But it's not about doing that constantly either. Because like you also see reps that have read Challenger Sale and then like listen to it while they're in the gym and then they're like, hey, let me stop you there, Brian. Yeah. Let me let's just talk about that a little bit. And there's like 5 people on the call and you're like, what's going on? Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting very deep down a rabbit hole. But I think just you're cautious on the side of providing value. Like there's a lot of different ways to provide value. And we can't say like that's like a whole different topic in of itself of like, how do you do that? Yeah. But I think it all ties in together of like, don't do too much because if you do too much, you're actually going to be seen kind of slimy. If you do too little, then you're definitely going to be seen slimy. So anyway, topic for another day. Last one here, not being desperate, chasing prospects. Like, I think there's a lot of things that go on outside of our control as salespeople, and I think we often take on this burden of thinking that we are the sole people responsible for this deal happening. Like, it is literally like how we respond to emails, how quickly we respond, how we carry ourselves. Like, yeah, I mean, I have my opinions, but I've talked for like 5 minutes now. So I want to get to your take.
No, I think this, making this kind of real for the person on the outside looking in, right? Let's say you've done some of these things that we've talked about. You are confident. You've put in the work to really understand your product, how it fits in the market, all these different things. I think especially my first year or two, I had a really hot streak and I did incredibly well. And even when I was doing well because I was newer, there were times where I maybe, I was so proud of how much I knew the product that I would try and have like deeper conversations with a prospect than I should have. And then because I didn't actually qualify if it was a real deal, I found myself like trying to chase them, calling them, getting ghosted, because in my mind, I was proud of myself, like get my golden star for being the SDR account executive that knows the product, but I didn't actually close the deal. The flip side is I also think, even, certainly if you're not hitting quota, things aren't going well, like that's pretty obvious that you're desperate. But I also think early on as well, I wanted to see how far I could push it. And getting President's Club, hitting not just 100%, but 150, setting all-time company records, and I still have that drive. But I also think there was a time early on where, my first year I hit 238% of my number as an AE, it blew it out, and I just wanted to keep going and going and going. And that actually, oddly enough, because I got almost overconfident, came across as very desperate. And then I got away from the fundamentals. I was desperate chasing prospects again. And that's what I would say is I think over time, like over a 5 to 10 year timeline, if you're in sales in a good way, it will humble you. You will see if maybe you're that unconfident salesperson that's finally mustering up the courage to try it. Yeah, you're going to come in and, for lack of a better word, kind of like simp, right? Ask the prospect if they need anything, like, hey, can I help with this? Can I do this? The flip side is like if you're overconfident and or they get the sense that this really means something to you, even if it's not in the sense of like just getting to your number, maybe this is like a guaranteed President's Club. Maybe this is the deal that you're going to close and immediately like tell everybody about that 100K commission check that you got. Like, those are the things you really have to keep in check, because desperation will manifest in many different forms. And going back again to the original topic, it's like that will make you seem, however the desperation, obviously desperation makes you seem slimy, but I think it's important to understand on the outside looking in how it's not just the person who's barely hanging on, who's, being desperate because they need this or they're going to lose their job. I think it's also on the other side where you have ulterior motives for any way, shape, or form other than like trying to close the deal and do what's best for your customer, which is too much of a generalization, I realize. But if your focus is an alternative agenda, if this win is going to be the thing that like gives you the promotion and they sense that, however they do, it's just going to look really, really bad.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And I think also I go back to the study quite a lot because I think it's so fascinating and so true as well, is like in today's world, especially selling SaaS, like these buyer committees, they are already like 75-80% of the way toward a decision.
Yep.
Like, your role as a salesperson is important. It's not like it's very important, because like that last 20%, that can shift a lot. It can change things. It kind of like, it also is a proxy for like what does the rest of their engagement look like with this company, right? Like, if you're super slow to respond, all these different things, then they're going to assume that that'll be the service level that they're going to get across every single segment of customer success, or blah, 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 the rest of the engagement. Mm-hmm. So sales is definitely important, but I think understand that like you not getting back to a prospect within like 15 minutes, or like you not crafting a Picasso of an email like every single time, is not going to like ultimately change, necessarily the outcome of the deal. Yep. Sure, like, if you can increase your average by 2%, that's huge, right? Like, I mean, we're in the field where like those little percentage increases are massive. Yep. But I think we talk a lot about like, how sales skills and what you develop in a sales career kind of carries over to entrepreneurship. Another thing that I really think is valuable is just getting comfortable with the ebbs and the flows, like regression to the mean. Probably one of the most important skill sets if you are thinking about, moving into being an entrepreneur. Like, I mean, the reality of our business too is like we can have 1 month where we absolutely crush it, or we can have like 2 weeks where our business is absolutely doing great. We've had so many students sign up, and we'll have like 1 week of like a desert, like there's no students. And very, very similar. Like, and not to get like super zen here, like super statistical analysis with people, but this is a real occurrence. And it happens across everything.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just sales, it's your business, it's your life, it's everything.
Yeah.
That's just kind of like how life works. And I think this comes with maturity. Like the longer that you are a seller, the more comfortable you'll get with this, the more that you'll understand that like, hey, even if I've had 3 weeks of not having closed shit, if I just stick to my system that has been working for a year and a half, things are probably going to work out. Like I've had weeks or months at Vanta where I'll start off with like 0 deals closed, like to a quarter.
Yeah.
And then like in the last like few weeks, everything will just come through.
Yeah.
And I'm sure like, I mean, if you're out there listening, you're an AE or something else and you have an actual quota with closed won revenue attached to your number, you've probably been in the same situation. So getting comfortable with that.
I was going to say, I would just add one more example. And it's funny because I played this perfectly and then I got overconfident after this happened. But like a very real example of avoiding desperation when things are going well. At the end of my first year as an AE, literally the last day of, so we broke our quota into an overall for the year, but also in halves. So if you exceeded your quota in either half, you would immediately go into accelerators. And on the last day of that 6-month half, I had the largest deal in company history at the time for our cloud product on the line. And this guy, very great customer, really classy guy, but he knew it was the end of the quarter and they were definitely playing their cards to try and get like last minute points shaved off the deal. And everybody knew going into this call, this was going to be a final pricing call because we had given them the ultimatum of signing by midnight that night. And he asked me at the very end of the call, like, he was like, hey, Eric, do you mind like staying on the call for a couple more minutes? And I was like, shit, like, here we go, and I knew it was going to be the like, hey, we're right there. We appreciate everything you guys have done, but like, I just don't know if we can get it done today. I just want to know from your perspective, is there anything in it for you if we finish this by midnight? And of course there was. I was at 101% of my number. This deal alone was 130% of my number, all in accelerators. And I was sitting there and instead of saying like, yeah, it's really important for us to get this done. I think, it's good for you and like we could get you set up and ready. I'll just go back to the questions for everyone's reference, but he literally was like, Eric, we're right there. I don't know if we can get it done today. I want to help you too. And he was like trying to appeal to me and all of these different things. He was like, is there any advantage, for you if we get this done today? And without hesitation, I just felt it coming. So I was like, hey, at the end of the day, I just want to make sure we get this right and make sure all the pieces are in place. And I shut down the negotiation talk and they signed by midnight. And again, like it's easy to sit here and talk about like the winners because I've definitely had cases where I've been desperate the wrong way. Yeah. But it's like, that's kind of a combination of the different things and maybe outside the scope of this in terms of negotiation and all of those things. But if I had been desperate, if I didn't handle that situation correctly, in all reality, we probably get it done by the end of the day, but I probably shave another 10% off and like, just don't hold the frame. Don't, do everything that we've talked about in this episode and also in other conversations as well. So, yeah.
No, and there's also the other side of that actually. So, at the time of recording this, like I currently have the highest ACV at Vanta by a hot mile. And so the way that I approach that too is like just being calm. Like the way that you present things is huge, right? If you get to the end of like a deal and it's like, you're presenting the numbers and you're saying, hey, like for instance, we have different pricing tiers, right? And so we price based on buckets. So once you move into a new bucket, ultimately you're going to bump up significantly. And so if I know that somebody is on the cusp of moving into that new tier, being very calm and collected, I'll just be like, hey, like, do you want to secure like, this rate for the next 3 years? Even if you move into like a new headcount bucket, you'll keep the same rate. And just like saying that, like I've had so many people, like I don't have to discount a single cent. Yep. And I get like 3-year contracts left and right. Yep. Almost every single one of my deals is like a multi-year contract. Yep. I think it's the way that you say it. Right. But if you're starting out and you're like coming out of the gates, like, hey, look, I can give you 10% for every single year that you add. Do you want that? Okay. Anyway, it's not gonna be like that. I was like obviously over dramatizing it there, but
the other side too is like unconfident. It's like, hey, if you wanted to lock in the same rate for 3 years, but anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it comes with time. So like you get more comfortable. You go through these scenarios like the one that you were talking about all the time, and you just kind of learn to see like what works and what doesn't, but. Also something that we didn't necessarily talk about too much, but just having a system for yourself, like that's something that I think is extremely important as a salesperson. Like you need to be fluid still. right? Like don't feel like you're like having a system does not mean locking yourself into a binary box where like you're like, okay, yes, like sorry, we cannot do that. Absolutely no. Like we cannot move outside of our discounting and there are limits to that, right? But the whole point of having a system for yourself is that you don't go down to the lower median of like the cap of like how much you can discount. You should honestly never get there as a salesperson unless like, I mean this is a whole other topic, right? Like get negotiation strategies and so forth. But having a system in place allows you to stop worrying so much about like creating custom negotiation terms on a deal by deal basis.
Yeah.
The reality of everything is like 80% of your deals are going to be very similar. So create a system for yourself. Yeah. Right.
And I think a very real example in the last like year or two is, like how this manifests if you're new to sales, if you're worried about, or you maybe naively think you can close everything. It's like, we'll just use round numbers for an example, but a past prospect, we did a couple discovery questions. We were planning an on-site and it was clear we were going to quote them at least about 100K, just a nice even round number for reference. And then they had on the call, they were like, honestly, we were hoping for something more in the 20K range. Conversation's done. Like, granted, we had some back and forth, but it's like, there is nothing you can do fundamentally as a salesperson. If someone is expecting 10 to 20% of what you're going to quote them, they are not your prospect. They are not a customer of yours. There is no scenario where they're going to buy. Sure, there are things you can do to try and, hold the value of what you've uncovered. There are things you can do to, ensure that they understand why it's 100K. But if they don't budge from that, you flying on site, you getting your CEO involved, you getting your CTO to connect with their CTO, almost never going to change anything, period, unless they're like best friends from college and like strike up a conversation that way. So I think there's many different things we could keep getting into, and these are all at this point kind of like intermingled and meshed. But I think it's a great overview for someone on the outside looking in of really the ways to just be a productive seller, certainly in the context of tech sales. And I think some of this also abstracts out to cars, to insurance, to real estate, to all of those different things as well.
These are principles that apply. I mean, obviously everything that we do stems from tech sales and our experiences in tech sales. And, obviously we work with like coaches who have like 10, 15, 20 years of experience at this point. So this is like a compilation of all the things that we see every single day through our students, through our own like careers. But absolutely, like I would say selling software, like you kind of have to be like at the top of the field of like almost every single segment, because it's, it is a very cutthroat industry. You have to be very good at what you do. Not saying that other fields aren't, but I think if you are selling not software, there's a lot of gold in here too. But sure. I think this was solid. And as always, like if you like this, like, comment, subscribe, like let us know what type of content that you want to see. Like we look at that stuff. We Definitely. Monitor every single comment. We respond to people. If there's a specific topic where you're like, hey, I'm struggling with this, or like I really want to see more content on this, let us know, because like that's ultimately what drives the
For sure. And I would just say too, if you're new, again, like obviously we'd appreciate it if you subscribe. And if you are looking at tech sales as a career, we own and operate higherlevels.com. So we don't take on any sponsors. We actually fully support ourselves through that platform where we help people break in. We also work with SDRs that are trying to become top performing SDRs and promote to AE, and also account executives that are looking to become, President's Club, hitting and smashing their quota and ultimately promoting to enterprise or management or whatever their goal is as well. So nonetheless, if you enjoyed this, if you're not in that position, I hope you got a lot out of it. And we'll see everybody on the next one.